Mr. Harold Jenkins, a man whose life had settled into a quiet, almost monastic rhythm following his retirement and the absence of his wife Margaret, instantly knew something was profoundly out of sync the moment he returned from his early market run. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was his sanctuary, and its security was something he never neglected. Yet, the front wooden door, which he always checked with the precise, practiced movement of a former park ranger, was slightly ajar, catching the early morning wind and swinging with an almost playful, yet deeply unsettling rhythm. Harold stopped on the threshold, a seasoned anxiety tightening his chest. His hand, as if guided by an ancient memory, slipped into his coat pocket. There, he grasped the familiar, solid presence of the small knife he had carried since his ranger days, an old, almost unnecessary habit that now served as a meager comfort. This morning, he needed that comfort. Pushing the door fully open, he stepped inside. The sight that greeted him was a startling tableau of domestic upheaval. It was as if a sudden, localized squall had swept through the small, rustic living room, acting with deliberate malice. Cushions had been violently ejected from the armchair, a thick rug was aggressively twisted and rucked across the floorboards, and books lay splayed face down, their spines broken, scattered like fallen soldiers. The final dramatic touch was a shattered ceramic mug, its pieces glistening faintly beside his favorite reading chair. Everything suggested a sudden, violent storm, one that had focused its fury entirely within the cabin walls. And then he saw the architect of the devastation. Right in the chaotic heart of the room, stretched out on the dusty, disturbed floorboards, was the Bobcat. Its distinctive spotted fur, a beautiful pattern of tawny gold and black, now speckled tragically with the remnants of pillow down. Its limbs were stiffly extended, its head tilted at an impossible dramatic angle, eyes fully closed. There was no movement, no shallow rise of its flanks, no faint whisper of breath. It was a posture of absolute, unmoving finality. Mr. Harold froze, the grocery bag slipping slightly in his suddenly numb fingers. A wave of possibilities washed over him, each one worse than the last. A dead animal, an injured one, or a clever predator playing possum, waiting for him to drop his guard before making a lethal leap. He moved forward, slow, measured steps across the debris-strewn floor. When he was just a few feet away, preparing to assess the situation, the stillness exploded. The creature sprang to life, a sudden lightning-quick shift from death to dynamic motion. It gave its body a casual, full-body shake, scattering the remaining white fluff, and stood calmly, utterly composed. It was not fearful, nor did it exhibit any sign of guilt over the surrounding mess. Instead, it fixed Harold with a cool, judging gaze, one that implied he was the one who had rudely interrupted the solitude. With a fluid movement, the Bobcat then vaulted onto the wide windowsill and began, with immense focus and dignity, to groom one of its paws, the picture of detached, post-performance contemplation. Harold let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a great, ragged whoosh of bewildered relief. "Oh, it's you," he managed to whisper. The dramatic creature that had just orchestrated the small-scale, utterly convincing drama was Isolde, the name he had bestowed upon her. Since the day she had simply walked into his quiet life, demanding attention and adoration, Isolde was unlike any bobcat he or any ranger had ever known. She possessed an absolute lack of fear of humans and an almost arrogant refusal to hide. Instead, she performed. From the impossibly slow, deep, regal yawns she produced to the deeply critical stares she threw his way when he was attempting something as mundane as setting the dinner table, every movement had a distinct, theatrical purpose. Her presence was a constant, unspoken declaration. "You are being watched. Pay attention to the star." Harold remembered their beginning. He had thought he was merely offering a meal to a hungry wild animal, but the moment he witnessed her perfectly executed three-legged limp, a blatant begging technique that instantly vanished the second her food bowl was full. He understood. He had not rescued Isolde. He had been carefully, deliberately chosen as her primary patron and lifelong audience. From that day forward, the cabin had become the stage for a never-ending play. The silence that had once filled his home, the lingering quiet since Margaret's death, was banished. It was replaced by a continuous soundscape, imperious meows, the sharp clink of objects being intentionally knocked onto the floor, and the dramatic, calculated patter of her paws. Isolde had smashed the dusty stillness of his solitude with every grand, theatrical gesture. She would never indulge in the common, affectionate gestures of a house cat, never sitting on his lap or rubbing against his legs. But sometimes, in the quiet evenings, she would settle close to him, tail perfectly curled, staring into the distance. In these precious moments, Harold would rest his hand nearby, an unspoken offer of contact. She could accept or reject it. And sometimes, with the utmost subtlety, Isolde would allow the slightest brush against his fingers, just enough to make him feel privileged, just enough to communicate, "You have been permitted to remain." Isolde had developed her own clear, complex language for her audience. 3 successive, drawn-out yawns meant hunger. Lying stiffly on her left side meant yes. Lying on her right side, an emphatic no. When he was 5 minutes late with her breakfast, she didn't waste her time with simple meows. That would be beneath her dignity. Instead, she would march into the bathroom, slowly, pointedly, unroll the entire spool of toilet paper onto the floor, and wait by the ensuing paper mountain. When he glared at her, she would return his gaze, calm and utterly magnificent, teaching him a necessary lesson in the essential laws of punctuality. The incident with the toilet paper was a defining moment in Mr. Harold's life with Isolde. It wasn't merely mischievous. It was a deliberate, calculated strike against his perceived inefficiency. After his initial shock at the shredded paper covering the bathroom floor, he had knelt down and started cleaning. Isolde had watched him from the doorway, her paws neatly tucked, her posture radiating judgment. He tried to scold her, to appeal to some sense of domestic propriety, but the Bobcat had merely blinked slowly, a gesture that perfectly conveyed, "My dear man, you have only yourself to blame for this inconvenience. Punctuality is the courtesy of kings, or in this case, queens." It became a non-negotiable rule. Isolde ate on time, or the cabin paid the price. This level of performance was constant, exhausting, and utterly captivating. Isolde's dramatic repertoire was vast, encompassing everything from a full-body slump onto the floor when offered a brand of food she deemed inferior, to the silent treatment, where she would sit in the corner of the room with her back to him for an entire evening. Yet, underneath the constant performance, there was a bond forming, one built on mutual respect and unexpected moments of grace. One particularly harsh winter day, Harold was struck down by a violent cold, forcing him to spend the entire day confined to his bed. He felt miserable, feverish, and deeply alone. Isolde, sensing the disruption, did not immediately stage any new drama. She did not exploit his vulnerability for a snack or an unscheduled belly rub, an act she would never permit anyway. Instead, she vanished. Harold, shivering beneath a pile of blankets, heard no movement, no clinking, and no theatrical yawns from her usual perch atop the bookshelf. When he finally managed to turn over in the early afternoon, groaning with discomfort, he found her. Isolde was not in the room, but beneath the bed, lying motionless, her large golden eyes wide open and fixed on the floorboards, completely still. She was simply there, a silent sentinel, an anchor in his illness. After a few minutes, she slowly climbed onto the bed. She didn't press against him or attempt any form of common physical affection. She lay down parallel to his body, perhaps a foot away, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the subtle warmth radiating from her muscular form. She was merely being present, That day, Mr. Harold felt a warmth that went far beyond the thermal capacity of the thick wool blanket. It was the warmth of true companionship, the silent acknowledgement of shared vulnerability. She stayed there until the fever broke, a wild creature keeping watch over a sick man. Her usual theatricality dropped entirely in the face of genuine need. Isolde's presence even began to bridge the gap between Harold and the outside world. He rarely used video calls, but when his granddaughter Sarah called one afternoon, Harold decided to answer. Midway through the call, as Harold was discussing the progress of his new firewood shed, Isolde decided she was bored with the background role. In a move that could only be described as a perfectly timed entrance, she launched onto the desk. She proceeded to shove her beautiful face directly into the camera lens, momentarily filling the screen with a flash of spotted fur and bright gold eyes. She then walked across the keyboard, typing a quick series of nonsensical letters that brought the chat to a grinding halt. Sarah, on the other end, erupted in delighted laughter. "Grandpa, she looks exactly like Grandma Margaret when she was young and demanding attention," Sarah gasped, wiping a tear. Isolde, having achieved her desired effect, attention and a brief disruption of the human's focus, was utterly unimpressed. She turned her back on the camera with a flicker of her tail against a glass of water, sat down, and began contemplating the desk lamp as if considering its future existence. The performance was over. The audience was dismissed. As night fell, Harold would often pull out his old harmonica, a battered thing he hadn't played since Margaret had passed. He'd start with a simple, mournful tune. Isolde wouldn't listen quietly. She would sit up, tilt her head back, and howl along, a sound that was more wild and resonant than any sound he could make. They were a strange two-member band, the man and the wildcat, filling the dark cabin with their shared eccentric music. One evening, fueled by boredom, or perhaps a desire to establish dominance, Harold challenged her to a yawning contest. 3 full minutes they went at it, man versus feline, each attempting a more exaggerated, noise-filled yawn than the last. Isolde, naturally, won with a final, magnificent, jaw-cracking effort. Following her triumph, she rested her chin lightly on his knee, wearing an expression of weary, tragic victory, a performance fit for an Oscar-winning drama. Isolde was not merely an actress, she was a companion who felt deeply, even if she expressed it theatrically. This was a truth Harold learned one brutally cold winter morning. He woke up, the world outside painted entirely white by a heavy, muffling snow. He went through his routine: coffee, firewood check, and the call for Isolde. But there was no dramatic response, no entrance, and no regal yawn from the top of the bookshelf. He assumed she was sulking. Perhaps he had neglected to applaud her previous night's howl sufficiently. But as the minutes stretched into a tense hour, a cold stone of genuine fear began to settle in Harold's chest. The silence, after so many months of performance, was deafening and terrifying. He knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the weather, that something was profoundly wrong. Mr. Harold found the tracks near the back door, a door he was absolutely certain he had secured with a sturdy latch the night before. Isolde, however, possessed a rare talent for manipulating anything designed to remain closed. The paw prints were distinct, sharply imprinted in the thick, fresh layer of snow that had fallen overnight. They led away from the comforting structure of the cabin in an uncompromising straight line, heading directly toward the intimidating density of the pine forest that bordered his property. The heavy, relentless snow had painted the world in shades of pure white, muffling all sound and making the cabin feel like the only surviving structure in existence. But the beauty was deceptive. The forest was a different, far more dangerous realm. Harold quickly pulled on his heaviest coat, laced his boots, and grabbed his flashlight, despite the morning light. He knew that beneath the heavy, low-hanging branches of the pines, it might as well be dusk. He called Isolde's name, his voice raw and grating against the unnatural silence. He followed her tracks, a desperate hunter tracing the path of his lost companion, watching as the prince wove through the closely packed trees, across a frozen, snow-covered creek, and up a small, treacherous slope where the snow came up to his knees. With every strained step, the cold knot of fear in his stomach tightened. Isolde was indeed unique, a creature of profound personality, yet she remained, fundamentally, a wild animal, or at least she had been once. What if, Harold worried, she had finally heard some deep, undeniable call of her wild blood? What if she had decided she was finished with the human world, done with the quiet domestic arrangement, and weary of her captive audience? What if something dark and irreversible had happened to her out here? Something he had failed to prevent, because he had allowed himself to be lulled into complacency by her dramatic performances. Time became distorted in that white, frozen wilderness. Harold searched for what felt like an eternity. 3 hours, perhaps 4, each minute stretching out and compressing simultaneously. His fingers went numb inside his gloves. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps. And still, there was no sign of the spotted performer. Only her tracks, a dwindling, heartbreaking trail of footprints leading further and further away into the wilderness. He was finally forced to turn back, defeated and absolutely terrified. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, making him feel older and more frail than his 60 years. As he trudged through the snow, the cabin came into view, looking different somehow, smaller, emptier, a mere fragile structure of wood and nails, not a home filled with life and unpredictable drama. Harold dragged himself up the porch steps, shaking snow from his boots, and pushed open the front door with the weary resignation of a man who has lost everything important twice. And there she was. Isolde lay before the hearth, where the fire had burned down to only glowing embers in his frantic absence. Her fur, usually so bright and fluffy, was soaked through, darker than usual, plastered to her body in heavy, wet clumps. This was not a performance. There was no theatrical pose, no carefully calculated expression of woe or majesty. She simply lay there, her sides heaving slightly with each difficult measured breath. Her golden eyes, the same eyes that usually sparkled with mischievous intent, were fixed on him with an intensity that immediately stopped him in the doorway. It was not a look of gratitude, nor was it fear. It was an interrogation. "Where did you go?" those eyes seemed to demand. "It's not where was I, but where were you when I needed you?" Harold dropped to his knees beside her, uncaring of the melting snow and wet fur. His hands hovered over her body, afraid to touch her, yet desperately afraid not to. "Isolde," he whispered, and the sound of her name cracked with emotion. "I was looking for you. I was so worried." She blinked once, slowly, deliberately, and in that single deep blink he understood the truth. She hadn't been lost. She knew precisely where she was and where her home was, and she knew how to return. But he hadn't been there when she got back. Had she, perhaps, gone back out into the blizzard, searching for him when he didn't immediately appear? Had she been as terrified for his safety as he had been for hers? He quickly grabbed 3 thick towels, all he could find, and began to gently dry her fur. For once, Isolde did not protest. She didn't squirm away, nor did she give him the famous look that indicated he was overstepping the bounds of their peculiar relationship. She permitted him to tend to her, to fuss, to worry out loud. She allowed him, for this brief, vital moment, to be needed. When he had finally built the fire back up into a roaring, comforting blaze, she moved closer to the heat. But not before she glanced back at him, a quick check, as if to make absolutely certain he was still there, still real, and still firmly within the confines of the cabin. That night, for the very first time, Isolde slept on his bed. She didn't choose the foot of the bed, where a common cat might curl up. She lay right beside him, close enough that he could feel the radiating warmth returning to her body and hear the steady, strong rhythm of her breathing. Harold barely slept, checking on her every few minutes, needing to reassure himself that she was still present, still breathing, still real, a powerful, vulnerable companion who had unexpectedly returned from the white wilderness. In the quiet, slow months that followed the terrifying winter incident, Mr. Harold started piecing together the subtle, almost invisible clues about Isolde's past. He realized she carried the echoes of a former life. She knew, for instance, exactly how to manipulate the latches on various doors and cabinets, a skill suggesting prolonged exposure to human living spaces. She displayed no fear whatsoever of the loud, buzzing sound of the vacuum cleaner, a device that normally sends wild animals fleeing. She was visibly accustomed to music, yet she reacted with dramatic, flinching terror only to the sudden, sharp crack of thunder. Isolde, Harold concluded, had once belonged to someone. She was not a completely feral cat. The fragility of their unusual partnership was abruptly tested one afternoon. A vehicle he didn't recognize, a heavy-duty pickup emblazoned with the logo of the Regional Wildlife Services, pulled up the snowy drive. Two figures emerged, a stern-looking woman holding a clipboard and a large man carrying a rifle, pointed safely at the ground, but clearly a tranquilizer gun. The officers were professional, but their purpose was stark and uncompromising. They informed Harold that they had received reports of a habituated bobcat in the area, and that by law she had to be captured and released back into the designated wilderness areas to ensure her safety and the safety of the community. Harold's jaw tightened. He knew the rules, having enforced them himself for 30 years. "She's not hurting anyone," he stated, his voice dangerously low and steady. "It's not about immediate hurt, Mr. Jenkins," the woman replied, her tone sympathetic but unyielding, consulting the user-known character Carl's name on her clipboard. "It's about what's best for the animal. Bobcats are not meant to be pets." "I know that," he countered. But knowing it intellectually and accepting the emotional reality were two vastly different things. Isolde, meanwhile, made her entrance. She did not bolt. She did not hide. She had, in fact, prepared for this scene. She chose Harold's favorite flannel shirt, the one he wore most often, and the one that smelled most distinctly of him, which was draped over the armchair. She curled up on it like a perfect, enigmatic sphinx, her paws neatly tucked under her chest, and her tail wrapped precisely around her body. From this majestic perch, Isolde stared directly at the officers. Her expression was utterly devoid of fear or aggression. It was purely, devastatingly evaluative. She was judging their uniforms, their purpose, and their worthiness to be in her cabin. When the male officer took a tentative step forward, Isolde's ears flicked back, not in a threat, but a minimal, powerful statement. "I see you. Do not make assumptions about my intentions." "Has she shown any aggressive behavior?" the woman asked, her pen poised. "Never," Harold instantly responded. "She has never bitten, never scratched, unless we were playing and she forgot herself. She's gentle." The officers exchanged a hesitant glance, and the man lowered the tranquilizer gun slightly. "Mr. Jenkins, we've had reports for months. Neighbors are concerned." "Concerned about what?" "That she exists." The words came out sharper than Harold had intended. "She stays on my property. She is not hunting pets or threatening people." "That's not entirely true," the woman corrected gently. "Martha Henderson called about a bobcat sitting on her porch last month." "That was once," Harold protested. "Isolde was just curious. She left when Martha came outside." "Martha said the bobcat looked at her through the window for 20 minutes. Harold almost smiled despite the tension. That sounded exactly like Isolde, undoubtedly judging Martha's choice of curtains or the highly questionable arrangement of her ceramic figurines. The officers spent over an hour documenting the unusual arrangement. They watched as Isolde, bored with her sphinx pose, sprang down, stretched with an exaggerated flourish, and then padded over to the water bowl. They noted how she rubbed her cheek against the doorframe, clearly scent-marking her territory. They observed how she moved through the cabin with absolute familiarity, knowing exactly where the creaky floorboard was and effortlessly avoiding it. How long has she been here? The male officer asked. 8 months, give or take, Harold answered. And she came to you? You didn't capture her? She walked in one morning like she owned the place, Harold said, a genuine, undeniable smile tugging at his lips. I left the door open while I was bringing in groceries. When I turned around, she was sitting in the middle of the kitchen, looking at me as if I was late for her breakfast reservation. The woman continued to make extensive notes, asking about feeding, vet care, and whether he had vaccinated her. Harold admitted he had held back on veterinary visits, fearing precisely this outcome, an official decision to remove her. In the end, it was Isolde herself who forced the final decision. As the officers were preparing to leave, discussing the logistics of a return visit with capture equipment, Isolde did the unexpected. She walked directly over to Harold, sat down squarely between him and the departing officers, and looked up at him with an expression he had never seen her wear before. It wasn't performative, it wasn't theatrical, it was simply present. The female officer caught the look. Harold watched her professional composure crack, just slightly. She glanced at her partner, then back at Isolde. "Mr. Jenkins," she said slowly, her voice dropping. "What I'm about to say is off the record. You understand?" He nodded, unable to speak. "That animal has absolutely no natural fear response towards humans. None. If we release her back into the wild, she will approach the wrong person." She trailed off, but Harold finished the thought for her. Someone would shoot her. "She can't go back, can she?" he whispered. "No," the officer admitted. "But she can't stay here either. Not officially. Unless—" She consulted her clipboard again. "You said you were a ranger. For how long?" 30 years. Retired 5 years ago. "And did you ever have permits for wildlife rehabilitation?" He saw the opening. "I did. They lapsed when I retired." "Well," she said, a faint, almost secret smile touching her lips, "you might want to look into renewing those. If you were a licensed rehabilitator, and you determined that a particular animal was non-releasable due to excessive habituation, and if you provided appropriate housing and care—" The sentence hung in the air, a lifeline. Harold felt a sudden, powerful surge of hope. "I could do that." "You'd need to do it properly. Documentation, proper enclosures, veterinary oversight. This would need to be legitimate," the wildlife officer had stressed before leaving. "It will be," Harold had promised, and he meant it. He stood at the door, watching the official vehicle disappear down the snowy, winding road. When he turned back inside, Isolde was perched on the back of the couch, her tail swishing slowly, those knowing golden eyes fixed entirely on him. "You heard all that, didn't you?" he asked her, a dry chuckle escaping his lips. "You knew what they were planning to do, and you simply decided to convince them otherwise with a well-timed look." Isolde responded by issuing a magnificent, full-toothed yawn, then settled down for a deep nap. The performance was over, the audience dismissed, but the stage had been saved. Over the following weeks, Mr. Harold Jenkins threw himself into the necessary paperwork with an intensity he hadn't felt since his youth. He contacted former colleagues, pulling old strings he thought had long since frayed, and filled out so many forms his hand cramped repeatedly. Renewing his wildlife rehabilitation permit was a complex, bureaucratic nightmare, but the thought of Isolde being safe and legally his was the only fuel he needed. The first step, however, was a professional checkup. He arranged for a visit from a veterinarian named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in exotic animals and, more importantly, possessed a remarkably calm and non-judgmental demeanor. Dr. Chen arrived and took the eccentric situation completely in stride. When it was time for the examination, Isolde, far from being a difficult patient, hopped directly onto the examination table. She presented herself with the poise of a seasoned patient who had done this 100 times before, simply waiting for the doctor to begin. "She's healthy," Dr. Chen confirmed, her hands running carefully over Isolde's body, while the bobcat purred, a sound like a powerful, vibrating motor. Good weight, good teeth, no signs of disease or parasites. How did you say you came by her? She came by me, Harold explained. I was just here, and she decided to arrive. Dr. Chen smiled, marking her notes. The best way to get a cat, really. They choose you, not the other way around. The hardest part of the entire ordeal was the construction of the required enclosure. The rehabilitation regulations were stringent, demanding a certain minimum space, specific types of fencing, and enrichment structures. Harold, using the carpentry skills he'd honed from his father and his decades of ranger work, decided to build it himself. He labored over the course of 3 exhausting weeks. The enclosure was large, much larger than the required minimum, built of sturdy wood and high-grade wire mesh. He incorporated natural elements, trees for climbing, large, flat rocks for sunbathing, and he even diverted a small runoff from the creek behind his property to create a flowing stream inside the space. He built a safe, insulated den box, ensuring every detail met and exceeded the legal requirements. The day it was finished, Harold proudly opened the gate. Isolde approached the new structure with the air of a highly paid critic visiting an underwhelming art installation. She inspected it thoroughly, sniffing every corner, testing the structural integrity of the climbing trees, and examining the creek water with a disdainful flick of her paw. Then she walked right past the open gate, returned to the cabin, curled up in her favorite armchair, and promptly went to sleep. The message was clear. The enclosure is undeniably well built and meets all regulatory standards, she seemed to convey, but it is entirely and completely unnecessary. Isolde had already chosen her territory, her home, and her audience. It was Harold's cabin, not the custom-built outdoor facility. Despite Isolde's firm rejection of the enclosure as a permanent residence, its existence was vital. It was the physical proof that he was a legitimate, licensed rehabilitator, satisfying the authorities and officially cementing her status as a non-releasable dependent under his care. On the 1-year anniversary of Isolde's arrival, a date he had estimated based on his journal entries and the thaw of the creek ice, Harold decided to mark the occasion. He bought a whole chicken from the market, an extravagance he rarely allowed himself, and spent the morning preparing it precisely as Dr. Chen had instructed. Plain steamed chicken, shredded and mixed with a little broth, arranged beautifully in her bowl. He expected the performance, the dramatic slow approach, the careful sniffing, the delicate consumption, and the regal retreat, the usual show. Instead, Isolde walked up to the bowl, paused, and did something that instantly stole his breath. She walked over to Harold, pressed her head gently against his hand, not rubbing or marking, but simply holding the contact. And from her throat came a sound he had never heard her make before, something soft, between a purr and a faint, questioning chirp, achingly sincere and utterly devoid of performance. He stood there, this old man with his hand resting on the head of a wild cat, and felt the sudden stinging prick of tears in his eyes. "You're welcome," he whispered, his voice thick. "You're so welcome, girl." Isolde ate her anniversary meal slowly, without the usual theatrical fanfare. When she was finished, she walked back to Harold, sat down beside his leg the way she sometimes did, and simply stayed there. They sat together on the porch as the late afternoon light softened, turning the harsh white of the snow-covered ground into a gentle, burnished gold. The spring air was crisp, already beginning to fill with the hopeful sounds of returning migratory birds. Neither of them felt the need to move, to speak, or to perform. They were simply, profoundly, present together. Later that evening, the deep, quiet contentment of the day led Harold's thoughts, for the first time in months, back to his wife, Margaret. He hadn't allowed himself to think of her often since her passing, The pain had been too sharp, the sense of loss too absolute. Margaret had loved animals deeply, but their life had been busy, focused on his demanding ranger career, leaving them no time or space for pets. She had always said that the moment he retired, they would fill the cabin with life. A cat, perhaps two. She had had 1,000 ideas for the cabin, plans to transform it from a functional dwelling into a vibrant, warm home. She had been the visionary, the one who saw life's potential. But she had died suddenly and without warning, 2 months before his official retirement date. The cabin had not become the home they planned. Instead, it had transformed into a silent mausoleum. For years, Harold had moved through it like a ghost, touching nothing, changing nothing. He maintained the space, kept it clean, but he was never truly living in it. It was a dusty memory preserved in wood and stone, until Isolde arrived. Margaret would have adored Isolde. He felt that truth in his bones. She would have laughed until she cried at the Bobcat's theatrical ways, at her exaggerated limp, and at her utter disdain for the schedule. More importantly, Margaret, with her innate understanding of complex beings, would have immediately grasped the nature of their arrangement. This was not a simple pet-owner relationship. It was a deep, peculiar partnership, a relationship between two profoundly unusual equals. She would have understood that Isolde chose him, and he had chosen her, in a specific, unique moment of need. Margaret probably would have developed her own separate relationship with the bobcat, one entirely distinct from his, because that's how it worked with cats. They weren't dogs, loving indiscriminately. They were discerning, and they chose individually. "She would have liked you," Harold whispered to Isolde that evening, looking down at the magnificent creature curled by his feet. Isolde's only response was a slight, elegant flick of one ear, the only acknowledgement needed for a truth that transcended human language. The profound stillness of their shared evenings soon shifted again. One night, Harold was abruptly woken around midnight by a scratching at the door. It wasn't the frantic scraping of an animal trying to escape. It was Isolde's specific, measured pattern, 3 insistent but non-desperate scrapes against the wood. Still half asleep, Harold stumbled out of bed, prepared to open the door and deliver a groggy scolding for her late return. Instead, when he opened the door and stepped back into the porch light, he found not one bobcat, but 2. Isolde stood in her usual composed manner, her figure casting a sharp shadow. But behind her, hesitant and trembling, was another, much smaller bobcat. A kitten, though nearly full-grown, it was painfully thin, its ribs starkly visible beneath a coat that was too sparse. One of its ears was torn and badly healing. Its eyes were huge with fear, reflecting the porchlight like twin, terrified moons. "Isolde," Harold breathed, confusion quickly replacing his sleepiness. "What have you done?" Isolde simply looked at him, the expression in her golden eyes absolutely clear and urgent. "Help. This one needs help." Harold instinctively stood back, opening the door wider. Isolde walked in with her usual queenly confidence. The younger bobcat remained frozen on the porch, torn between debilitating fear and the apparent safety that Isolde represented. Harold waited, silent and patient, barely breathing, refusing to make any quick movement that might spook the fragile newcomer. Finally, slowly, painfully, the young bobcat crept forward, following Isolde into the warmth of the cabin. Harold spent the rest of that night watching them. Isolde, setting aside her role as the demanding diva, instantly became the stern but loving guardian. She led the younger cat directly to the water bowl, then to the covered food container, showing him with actions rather than expecting the terrified animal to navigate the strange human territory alone. When the young one finally ate, ravenous but shaking with fear, Isolde supervised the meal with the air of a dedicated nurse. By dawn, the little bobcat had collapsed from exhaustion, curling himself into the smallest possible ball beside the cold fireplace. Isolde, instead of retreating to her favorite chair, positioned herself directly between the sleeping kitten and the rest of the cabin, guarding, protecting, taking on a role of profound responsibility. Harold looked at the frail, sleeping youngster. "We'll call you Hope," he whispered softly, "because God knows you needed some." Dr. Chen, the exotic animal veterinarian, came out to the cabin later that very day. Her expression was caught in a difficult balance between professional concern for the patient and outright, unadulterated amazement at the situation. She examined Hope carefully, her gentle hands checking the small bobcat's fragile frame. She treated the infected torn ear, administered antibiotics, and immediately drew up a careful, high-nutrition plan for the dangerously underweight kitten. She also drew blood for testing, needing to check for any diseases that could affect both Hope and Isolde. "Where on earth did she find him?" Dr. Chen asked, genuinely baffled, watching as Isolde supervised the entire procedure from her perch on the back of the couch. Isolde was motionless, her golden eyes fixed on the kitten, radiating a quiet, fierce proprietorship. "I have no idea," Harold admitted, shaking his head. "She was gone for a few hours, and then she came back with him." "Is he her kitten, do you think?" the doctor asked. Harold considered the timeline. Hope looked to be less than a year old, and Isolde had been with him for a full year. The math was difficult, unless she had arrived pregnant, a possibility he had seen no sign of. "I don't think so," Harold concluded. "I think she just found him. Found someone who needed help desperately, and brought him to the only place she knew was safe." Dr. Chen slowly shook her head, a deep professional wonder in her eyes. "Mr. Jenkins, in 20 years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen anything like this. Bobcats are solitary animals. They don't form this kind of bond, especially with unrelated young, unless forced." "Well, Isolde doesn't seem to have gotten that particular memo about bobcat solitude," Harold said dryly, a wave of pride washing over him. Hope's recovery was slow and agonizingly gradual. The younger bobcat was clearly traumatized by some dark experience that had left deep internal scars beyond the physical ones. Loud, sudden noises, like a dropped cooking pot or a distant chainsaw, sent him scrambling instantly for the cramped safety behind the couch. Quick, unexpected movements from Harold caused him to flinch violently. For the first week, Hope barely left his hiding spot. He would only emerge when Isolde coaxed him out for food and water, communicating with soft nudges and quiet, reassuring chirps that were far removed from her usual dramatic vocalizations. But slowly, painfully slowly, Hope began the arduous process of healing. Isolde was an astonishing, patient teacher. She was gentle and absolutely consistent in her behavior, showing Hope through her own bold, trusting actions that this cabin was a safe space, that the large, quiet human who lived here, Carl, could, against all instinct, be trusted. Isolde never forced interaction. She simply demonstrated security. Hope took all his cues from her. If Isolde was relaxed, Hope would slightly relax. If Isolde accepted a treat from Harold's hand, Hope watched with wide, cautious eyes. The major breakthrough came 3 weeks after Hope's dramatic arrival. Harold was sitting quietly on the floor, reading a book aloud, something he did occasionally for the calming rhythm of the words. Hope cautiously emerged from behind the couch. He moved with agonizing slowness, drawn by the steady, unthreatening presence of the man and the calming sight of Isolde asleep on the armchair. Harold stopped reading and remained perfectly still. Hope approached, trembling, and paused beside Harold's knee. Slowly, Harold extended one finger, offering the smallest possible point of contact. The young bobcat froze, his eyes locked on the old man's finger, fear warring with a desperate need for contact and safety. Finally, after what felt like an hour, Hope allowed it. Harold gently, carefully stroked the young bobcat's head with that single finger. Hope trembled violently, but did not flee. In that moment, Harold felt a triumph as complete and overwhelming as anything he had experienced in his decades in the field. It wasn't about conquering fear, it was about earning trust, a victory far greater than any physical feat. Years passed in the cabin, marked by the changing light on the porch and the slow, steady transformation of the animals within. Harold noticed the gradual changes in Isolde, the faintest touch of grey appearing in the tawny fur around her muzzle, the extra moment she now took to gather herself before an impressive leap onto the windowsill, the subtle shift in her priorities, more sleeping, less performing. She seemed content now to simply exist, rather than always demanding the spotlight. Harold also noticed his own aging with painful clarity, the protest of his knees on the morning walk, the reading glasses that had become a permanent fixture, the necessity of an afternoon nap that he would have scorned years before. But hope had flourished. He grew strong and confident, his coat gleaming, his movements carrying the fluid, silent grace of a healthy wild cat. He never developed Isolde's innate flair for the dramatic, possessing a quieter, more gentle charm. Hope loved to sit in the window and watch the birds, purred easily when Harold scratched behind his ears, and on cold nights he slept curled securely against Isolde. And Isolde, the fierce diva, allowed it, even seemed to take deep comfort in the warm, sturdy presence of her adopted companion. The morning routine evolved into a sacred, unalterable ritual. Mr. Harold would wake precisely at dawn, make his coffee, and open the cabin door. Isolde and Hope would emerge from their chosen sleeping spots, sometimes the enclosure, often a secluded corner of the cabin, and the three of them would settle onto the porch to watch the sun climb over the pine trees. Harold, now truly Carl, sat in his worn rocking chair, the heat of his coffee mug warming his hands. Hope always settled securely in the middle, a visual testament to his restored confidence, while Isolde always took the commanding position on the right. They rarely spoke. The silence between them was rich, full of understanding, companionship, and a bond that had long transcended species and the odd circumstances that had created it. Sometimes Hope would gently groom Isolde's ears, and the older Bobcat would close her eyes, leaning into the care. She accepted the affection with the same rare grace she brought to moments of genuine connection, a complete contrast to her demanding stage persona. Harold would watch them, feeling a profound sense of contentment that was so complete it often felt close to pain, the quiet, fulfilling ache of having finally found home again. His granddaughter, Sarah, began to visit more frequently now. Initially, she had been deeply skeptical about Isolde, worried that her grandfather was placing himself in grave danger by cohabitating with a wild animal. But her skepticism crumbled quickly after the first few visits. Sarah observed their routines with an appreciative eye. She saw Isolde's dramatic yawns and extravagant stretches performed for an appreciative human audience. She saw Hope, shy but willing, accepting treats directly from her hand. Most importantly, she saw her grandfather. Harold moved through his days with a sense of purpose and a quiet joy that had been completely absent during his early retirement and the long, silent years following Margaret's death. He was animated, busy, and constantly negotiating the terms of his life with a creature whose demands were both ridiculous and utterly compelling. One sunny afternoon, as Isolde supervised Hope's clumsy, half-hearted attempt to catch a fluttering butterfly near the porch railing, Sarah shared her thoughts. "You're happier than I've ever seen you, Grandpa," Sarah said gently, her eyes resting on the old man's contented face. "I am," he agreed immediately, looking at the bobcats with a soft, proprietary pride. "I didn't think I would be again, not after your grandmother died. But these two—" He trailed off, genuinely unable to put the depth of his feelings into simple human words. Sarah finished the thought for him, articulating the unique truth of their existence. "They chose you. That's special. That's really special." One warm summer evening, Harold was sitting in his chair, reading a forgotten book, when he felt the familiar weight of Isolde settling across his stomach. This was not an unusual occurrence, but it still felt like a significant act of trust every time it happened. She arranged herself with that theatrical precision, paws tucked under her chest, her head resting just below his ribs. He set the book aside, letting his hand rest lightly on her back, feeling the deep, steady rhythm of her breath, the solid warmth of her body through his thin shirt. He must have drifted off to sleep like that, because when he woke, the cabin was fully dark, the moon shining in silver streaks through the window. The book had slipped to the floor, and Isolde was still there, but something about her stillness had fundamentally shifted. Where there had always been an element of awareness, of readiness to spring away if needed, now there was only complete, deep relaxation. Her breathing was slow and even. Her entire body felt utterly loose against him, completely tension-free. One of her front paws had slipped free from its tucked position and hung over his side, vulnerable and totally exposed. Harold shifted slightly, a soft, testing movement. Isolde did not twitch, did not wake, did not adjust or reassert control. She simply stayed, trusting him entirely to keep her safe while she slept the sleep of a secure creature. "You're not performing anymore, girl," he whispered, his voice rough with sudden, powerful emotion in the darkness. "You trust me now." Isolde's ear flicked once, a minute acknowledgement of his voice even in sleep. Then she let out a soft sound, a deep, settling purr that was somewhere between a contented sigh and a low rumble. They stayed like that until dawn, an old man who had found his purpose again, and a wild creature who had found in him something neither had known they were desperately missing: a safe harbor, a silent pact, and a lifelong companion. Life continued its uneven, negotiated course. Mr. Harold learned that contentment was not the absence of difficulty or conflict, but rather the finding of deep meaning in the small daily negotiations and the inevitable reconciliations of their shared life. Isolde still had her moods, her high demands, and her distinct ways of expressing profound displeasure when Harold, Carl, failed to meet her exacting standards. One day, for example, she sulked for a full afternoon because Harold refused to engage in a highly elaborate game involving tossing a sock into a specific ceramic pot. She refused her food, turning her head away from her favorite steamed chicken with dramatic indifference. Harold, recognizing the familiar pattern, knew he couldn't force the issue. He simply took his favorite, most worn flannel shirt, the one she had chosen to sit on during the visit from Wildlife Services, and laid it carefully on her preferred chair. Isolde approached the flannel, paused, and then deliberately pressed her head against the fabric, inhaling deeply. Reconciliation achieved. It was her way of acknowledging his peace offering and forgiving his transgression, a ritual far more complex than any simple human apology. The cabin had transformed entirely from the early days of dusty, haunted silence. The radio, which Harold once kept humming constantly, just to stave off the loneliness, stayed off most days. The house was now filled with better, more honest sounds: the soft padding of paws on hardwood floors, the scratch of claws on the sturdy post he had built, and the complex, varied vocalizations that Isolde and Hope used to communicate with each other and with him. The picture frames, which he had kept face down after Margaret's death, were now upright again. They no longer held only photos of his late wife, but new ones captured by Sarah's patient camera, moments of Isolde's regal grace, Hope's shy acceptance of affection, and the two cats sleeping in impossible, intertwined positions. The cabin was no longer a mausoleum. It was a home, alive and full. He had even replaced the cheap, disposable paper plates he had used in his solitude with real dishes again. This was partly because it mattered now, as he was cooking real, complex meals, and partly because Isolde would sit on the counter, supervising his technique with all the demanding authority of a demanding executive chef. More practically, Hope would sometimes try to steal scraps if Harold wasn't careful, and that required actual plates that couldn't be easily knocked off the table. The paw prints along the hallway had become a permanent, endearing feature. He had attempted to clean up the muddy marks once, then immediately gave up, realizing they were the physical evidence of his happiness, proof that the space was lived in, loved, and fully claimed by its unconventional inhabitants. Harold's purpose had changed completely. He was no longer a retired man waiting out his years. He was the caretaker, the provider, the sole audience, and the quiet guardian of two utterly non-releasable wild souls. He was required daily to exercise patience, to negotiate space, to enforce rules, and to offer unconditional safety. He was, in essence, an active participant in life again. The greatest indicator of his deep contentment was his morning wake-up, where before he had woken with a vague sense of dread, he now started each day with a predictable, comforting trio of sensory input: the subtle, powerful purr of Isolde, the gentle bump of Hope requesting access to the porch, and his own quiet, satisfied smile. He was a supporting role in the longest, most important play of his life, and he felt more content than he had ever thought possible. The memory of the dark years after Margaret's death had not vanished, but the light had returned, stronger and more vibrant than before. Isolde had not replaced Margaret. She had simply cracked open the door that Harold had sealed shut, allowing life, noise, and necessary complication to flood back in. One morning, Harold watched Isolde and Hope play fighting, a silent, intense ballet of teeth and paws that ended abruptly with Isolde pinning Hope and delivering a sharp, final nip that clearly said, "I am still the queen." Hope, immediately submissive, then groomed Isolde's shoulder. Harold understood then that their life, messy and bizarre as it was whole. It was a family. As the years advanced, the progression of time grew softer, marked less by dramatic events and more by the quiet accumulation of moments. Isolde no longer leapt as high, preferring the lower, sunnier spots on the porch. Harold no longer stood as straight, often leaning on the doorframe when gazing out at the property. Yet their bond remained the central, unshakable axis of their lives. Hope, the once frightened kitten, grew into a magnificent, imposing cat, his quiet strength serving as a perfect counterpoint to Isolde's enduring, eccentric intensity. Harold's memory of Margaret never faded, but the pain had transformed into a gentle warmth. He often found himself talking to the Bobcats about her, sharing old stories, and observing how Isolde would sometimes flick her ear, or Hope would purr, as if acknowledging the past that had made the present possible. The cabin, once Margaret's planned refuge, and then Harold's unintentional prison, had become, through the sheer force of two wild animals' will, a genuine sanctuary. His granddaughter, Sarah, continued to visit, bringing groceries, gossip, and her calm, accepting presence. She no longer expressed worry about the danger. She saw the stability. She saw the love. She saw how her grandfather, who had once been on the brink of fading away, was now firmly anchored in the world, needed and necessary. One evening, Sarah brought Harold a professionally printed large portrait of Isolde, captured mid-yawn, a dramatic, teeth-baring masterpiece. Harold hung it prominently on the wall, next to a framed photo of Margaret smiling. He often looked between the two, realizing that both were magnificent queens who had, in their own unique ways, commanded his life and love. The most profound moments, however, remained the unscripted ones. During a particularly intense thunderstorm, a weather event Isolde still hated, she didn't retreat to her den box. Instead, she bolted directly to Harold's chair. She didn't sit on him, which would have been too undignified, but she squeezed tightly between the chair arm and his body, trembling only slightly, her entire weight pressed against him for comfort. Hope, meanwhile, settled directly on Harold's feet, creating a living, purring weight that grounded the old man. In that fierce moment of lightning and thunder, pinned between two wild animals seeking refuge from the storm, Harold closed his eyes and felt an absolute, unassailable sense of protection. He was not protecting them. They were protecting him. They were the life he fought for, the reason he stayed strong, the purpose that demanded his health. The progression of Isolde's theatricality had been a subtle, profound indicator of her earned trust. She still performed for Sarah, or for Dr. Chen during her mandated checkups, but for Harold, the need for the elaborate show had waned. It was replaced by a deeper, more vulnerable intimacy. The way she would lick his hand once after a meal, the simple act of sleeping securely on his bed, or her quiet tolerance when he adjusted her blanket on a chilly morning. Isolde was not just an actress anymore, she was a partner. As the final, inevitable years came, Harold watched as Isolde grew heavier, slower, yet somehow more majestic. He knew their time was finite, as all partnerships are, but there was no fear, only gratitude. He had been chosen, not rescued. He had been allowed to love and care for a creature of immense spirit. One soft spring morning, Harold woke up to the usual weight on his chest. Isolde had claimed the spot. He reached out to stroke her fur, finding her utterly still. Her body was relaxed, her golden eyes closed in a final, peaceful rest. There was no pain, no struggle, and most importantly, no performance. She had simply slept through the night, trusting him until the very end. Hope was the one who reacted. He sat beside the bed, his head bowed, emitting a series of low, mournful, repetitive calls, a sound far sadder than any human weeping. Harold, now truly alone again in the familiar cabin, wept, but his tears were not tears of desolation. They were tears of profound, gentle memory. Isolde had shattered his silence, filled his solitude, and brought him hope. She had restored his life. The cabin remained full. Hope stayed, finding a new, quieter relationship with Harold, who now spent more time tending to the young Bobcat, with a fierce, protective love. The flannel shirt still lay on the chair, cherished. The picture frames remained upright. The paw prints were never cleaned. Mr. Harold Jenkins, the old ranger known to his granddaughter as Carl, no longer lived in solitude. He lived in the rich, vibrant legacy of a bobcat who deserved an Oscar, and who, in the final act, gave him something infinitely more valuable than applause, the ability to live and to love again. His life had been the stage, and he was ready for whatever came next, because he knew, without a doubt, that he had played his most important, unscripted role to perfection.